Welcome back to story time. Well, we're into it. Let's just keep going. We find ourselves in a chapter called The Swan. Ophelia has heard screaming outside of the clinic and is deciding that she wants to help the scientist and the clinic and to go help whoever is screaming and being chased by a zombie that she knows how to take care of, because that's something that she can offer. The Swan. Even in the dark, it was easy to find the alleyway where a pale, thin teenager was screaming. She was cornered against a rough, broken brick wall with a rolling pin gripped tightly above her head. Her ribs showed through her torn t-shirt, and her red curls poked through her ripped wool hat. But there were no zombies cornering her. Zombies were not causing her to scream. There were 3 men, large, warm, human men. They wore dingy sleeves with no jackets, no hats. Their heads were bare with loose, oily hairs blowing in the drafts. Their yellow, furry arms were uncovered, and yet they were not freezing. They were agile and fluffed, paunchy but nimble, taunting the girl that they circled. Their taunts weren't aching with chilled, heavy sludge. They didn't have to tighten their scarves and pull down their hats. Their fingers weren't cold against their faces. They were warm, human men, and I was a cold, little zombie girl. It wasn't warm enough for the girl who was screaming either. Her throat was becoming hoarse and garbled. She clasped one arm around her middle where one of the laughing men jabbed her with a thick finger. He licked the tip and pronounced her delicious. The men cackled wickedly. They were worse than zombies. All of her shrieking made my ears pucker with tingles. I jammed the ends of my chipped green fingernails against my shuddering eardrums to block the noise. She wasn't attached to a fat man's leash yet. I wanted to save her, but how? 1 little zombie and 3 large, warm, human men. I could not scare them away. They would just smash my skull. But I needed to help her stop screaming. Sorry, put some of the microphone, but if I'm being honest, I don't even know how to use thoroughly. Cool, I really like that it's constantly forcing itself away from my face. It's really helpful. Oh, well, good. I hope it was making noise the whole time, too. That's nice. This is going to be a whole thing. Jesus H. Let's try it like that. All of her shrieking made my ears pucker with tingles. I jammed the ends of my chipped green fingernails against my shuddering eardrums to block the noise. She wasn't attached to a fat man's leash yet. I wanted to save her, but how? 1 little zombie and 3 large, warm, human men. I could not scare them away. They would just smash my skull. But I needed to help her stop screaming. I inched closer to her to get a better look, but when I bumped an empty can with my toes, the men whirled to look at me. Their teeth were almost as yellow as mine, but their muscles were much, much bigger. Go on, get! We got no food for you, squatter girl. The one with the longest beard swatted at me. Hey, the more girls the merrier. Let's sell her too, said another of the 3, wearing a dirty white muscle shirt, reaching for me. One of his buddies punched his arm away from me and spat in a shoe. She ain't ours. Don't complicate things. Let's just get ours and go. The first answered. I said, get out of here, squatter girl. The man with the beard kicked the empty can back at me. They turned away from me, circling and circling the skinny, screaming, red-haired girl. They didn't want to see me. They only wanted to see her drop her rolling pin and fall defeated into their hands. They taunted her with stained, braided collar that they shook in her face. While they threw trash into her curls and tugged on her pants pockets, I tiptoed up to her side in plain sight. The third man, wearing 2 different kinds of boots, threw a dead pigeon at me. "I said go away, squatter girl." I looked into the girl's mottled pink face, brushing the pigeon feathers off of my coat. She blinked at my loose teeth, barely held in my soggy gums. The dark didn't fool her. I was just another monster. "Stop screaming," I breathed, turning to the 3 giants. "Aim for their shins." She shrank and shook behind me. I rolled my eyes. Just another girl. The man with the beard snickered and galloped at me. He swung his golf club at my chest. This was a poor choice. Golf clubs only work on a couple of zombies in a row, and then they dent, bend, and break. It crashed into my ribs. It tingled a tiny bit. I snorted and stepped towards them to see how badly his club had bent, and to yell at him to go away with his stupid weapon. He hit my ribs with it again. I swatted at him with my hammer like he was a fly. I thought that he would bounce back and buzz at me again, that I would just shout fiercely. He and his buddies would listen, and then the girl and I would walk around the corner and go our separate ways, to our own squalid apartments, or her to the ranger station to report her kidnapping. But when I knocked him in the shin, I heard his bones splinter into shards. I pulled his club from his hands and tossed it to the side of the alley. He tried to kick me again, so I knocked him on the other shin. It shattered just as easily. He wasn't warm. He was fragile, breakable, and I had broken him. He whimpered and stayed down on the ground. I had forgotten how easily humans could break. It was a good thing that I was saving this girl, or they might have broken her. I stared at the remaining 2 men. I moaned a little, picturing them crumpled on the ground. My audible slip shattered their illusions of just another poor human squatter girl. "It moaned," said one. "It's a zombie. Go for its head." The man in the muscle shirt reached for the girl who was crouching against the brick wall, trying to disappear. When his knuckles wrapped around her shirt, she finally did as I instructed and hit him on the leg with her rolling pin. It echoed like her weapon might be made of marble. The man cursed, grabbed for her again. She wriggled out of his grasp and hit him on the wrist, which broke just as easily. He cried out and tried to swing at her with his other fist, but he was too slow, and she hit one of his feet, too. She stood up and hit him on his back. He toppled sideways. She pounded him again and again, harder and harder. He was going to be in pieces soon, but it was better than her being in pieces. I was glad that she wasn't the one falling apart. The third man, the one who had yelled to go after my head, followed me as I paced backwards down the alley. I didn't want to hit him. I only wanted to break zombie heads, not humans. If there had been 3 zombies attacking any girl, my assault would have been simple. It would have been easy to smash 3 cold, shuffling zombies. I wished that he was a zombie. I considered it for a few slow steps, but when he charged at me, I ran out of time. I decided. I craned my neck to my forearm and slashed it open with my teeth. I sucked some of my thick black blood out into my cheeks. I spat it into the palm of my hand and launched it at the man. It landed with a splatter on his chest. "Oh, God!" he shrieked. "Now are you gonna die, you stupid little brown zombie bitch!" What had he just called me? I filled my cheeks again and launched more infected sludge. He flailed his arms to block it and slipped in a puddle of my goo. I helped him fall faster by tapping on his shoulder with my blue wooden handle. He screamed louder than the girl he had been terrorizing, reached up for me, ripped my axe from my belt, and swung it at me. The edge connected with my shoulder. My arm landed on the pavement, separated from the rest of me. I stared down at him, uncomprehending. What had he called me? What had he just done? What happened to my arm? I slammed my foot across his stubbly chin. His neck popped and he lay still. A black river ran down my side, puddling next to my shoe. There was my right arm, lying on the ground, palm up, fingers curled and still, limp. And there was my collarbone, hooked right above my ribs where it was supposed to be, but empty. I picked up my fallen right arm. It dripped black tendrils where it ended in jagged bone. I could still see the spot where I had bitten my forearm open. I turned it over and cradled it so that the pale green fingers wiggled slightly, drooping, wherever gravity took them. The socket under my collarbone erupted in a volcano of molten tingles. Huh, I said, wobbling. I walked unsteadily past the girl. She had stopped screaming. She was crouched over the unconscious man that she had beaten. She stood up, spidery arms shaking like a web under the weight of her marble rolling pin, face flushed with stress. Thank you. They were going to sell me. Huh. I stumbled over an empty silver can. Thank you so much. Where will I go? She asked. Huh. I shook my head, looking at my arm. I waved goodbye with it, splashing the concrete in the flannel lining of my jacket. I'm only 14, she squeaked. I kept walking. She'd find a ranger, probably. I tripped away from the broken men with my broken arm all the way home and crawled into the messy closet blanket nest. My scratchy wool covers scraped against the raw edges of my peeling skin. Where was my mom? Why wasn't she there to hold me, her long brown fingers stroking my silky earlobe? She would bring me a washcloth if I got a fever. She would touch my forehead and tell me that everything was okay, that she knew who I was. I grasped my arm, clutched it against the empty socket where it needed to be. It burned with a forest fire of tingles. Where was Dad? Why didn't he notice my difference or kill me properly? Why couldn't he pull on his gloves and clean up the mess of men that I had made in the alleyway and chop them into a neatly constructed burn pile? Why couldn't he take my blood to the clinic for me, happy that I found a scientist to work with? Why had he abandoned me and left me alone? Not alone. With my ex-little sister, another failure. I could hear her scrabbling across the living room, her nails scraping at the splintering wooden floor, her knobby elbows angled up to her concave back, and her knees bent like a cricket's, crawling in search of water or something to chew. She found the curtains and ripped them lengthwise. She slammed into my closet door with her forehead. She throttled the box of tea bags that I left on the kitchen counter. I had no dreams to block her from my ears. I clenched my eyes tighter. I wished that zombies could dream. I sat up, re-damaging the tentative scabs that were forming around my arm. I needed to make a neater closet nest, like I had been taught. The blankets smoothed out before me, making little pockets for my feet, and a pouch that could hold warmed rocks, if I had had any. The last blanket I rolled and molded into the outline of 2 knees. I rested my sopping cheekbones against the woolly barbed kneecaps, staining them darker gray with my tears. I sobbed, retching and begging for dreams while I pressed my arm to its old place. I couldn't wiggle all 10 toes, they were getting too cold. But I knew that I had them all, even though Juliet had bitten one off while I was sleeping in the woods. I had snatched it from her jaws before she could swallow it. I had fit it into the palm of my hand, snowflakes drifting down to cover it while I looked up at the sky. I moved my slate gray sock and held the mauled toe against my foot, just to see how it looked, like a cloud, gaudy and standing out like I had painted an eggplant to wear with sandals. After a few minutes, the seam where the toe had torn started to scab over, darkly, and then as I watched, and as Juliet clamored, after a squirrel with my missing boot between her teeth, my green skin began to grow back over the scabs. After 3 days, her tooth marks disappeared completely from my foot, if never from my ruined boot. My zombie blood preserved me, and my human parts kept on healing, but I still couldn't dream. I was trapped in my closet, in my head, with no sunny image of a garden where my little sister could sit cross-legged picking strawberries. There was no meadow with a little brother to swing by with his sticky outstretched arms. No dream of a scientist working to cure the zombie in my living room so that I could run home with her, safe to touch and hug. I couldn't even have nightmares of the storm raging outside. The late winter blizzard rattled my windows while I rolled and clung to the arm that was stiffening against my shoulder. My stupor lasted forever as my moans and rattles matched the pitch and the tone of the wind thrashing the early spring sky. I became aware of the chill gathering around me. I struggled to be vertical. My arm was reattached, creaking and slow like the rest of me, lumpier than it had been, but not a separate piece. I forgot that I couldn't heel my shirt sleeves and they fell off into my lap when I sat up. My fingers were too cold to hold onto my shirts and jackets. I was almost too frozen to move. My arm was a deep, dark, naked lizard green. I wonder how long I had been asleep. I reached for my propane, shook all of my empty canisters. My hand rubbed numbly on the metal closet doorknob. I wrapped a wool blanket around myself and pushed. It swung open and slammed into the wall, greased not to squeak. I fell to the floor with the force of it. Juliet didn't stumble over to me for a welcoming chew. She was lying on the floor near the kitchen. I pushed myself to my feet. I put one foot in front of the other. I fell down again. Twice. More. I crawled over to Juliet. She was frozen solid, curled up around her empty water bowl, a glaze of ice across her hands where she had spilled the last of it, her mouth sealed shut with the same glassy sheen. She sounded brittle, wobbling against the floor. I was patting her too hard with my numb fists. I dragged myself to the refrigerator. Empty. No more propane canisters. Only 2 tea bags. Earl Grey. Hardly worth having. Nothing to burn. I had even burned the wooden spoon already. I shuffled gingerly to the window. I lifted the curtain with dead fingers. It was light out. Daytime snowflakes drifted on the gusts. I could either wait until nightfall to go looking for heat and risk freezing until spring truly arrived, or I could risk daylight, sighting of my thieving, killable green self. I moaned, too parched to gurgle. I needed water, warm water, and hot rocks, heated wool blankets, propane to burn for hours on end. Coffee. Humans made coffee in the morning. During the day, they left hot coffee in unguarded pots near windowsills purchased from places that I could find on my maps. Sumatra, Turkey, Chile. The radios talked about coffee from inside of store windows and truck depots that were open all night and reported that there were Colombian beans so aromatic that zombies would pace towards them from 900 yards or more. Maybe I could find some. I needed them. I used my tailbone to push the desk away from the front door. Maybe one of the squatters would have left something behind in an empty room. Maybe all of the squatters slept during the day just like me, and I could take their propane stashes while they slumbered. Maybe they wouldn't be in any better shape than me, or wouldn't even notice my green tinge, or be able to bash my skull in anyway. Maybe they had some coffee already made for me. I pulled the door and slammed it open into the apartment. "Hello?" A voice piped up from outside. I noticed that there was a bell attached to my doorknob. It jingled back and forth. "Hello?" the voice called again, closer this time. I hunched over and wrapped my blankets further around me. I tried to look harmless and commonplace, slouching like a drunk, timid squatter. I felt a heavy hand on my blanket. "Hello? What is your name?" A young girl's voice chirruped in my ear. I couldn't move. I wished I could at least shiver, look normal somehow. She pulled the blanket from my face and touched my cheek. I tipped myself sideways, slammed my head into the wall, leaned there. "Don't touch me," I growled at her. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "You were the zombie girl who saved me." I looked up the best I could through the film solidifying across my eyeballs. I could see the hazy outline of a young girl, maybe 15 or 11 if she was from a hiking family. I couldn't tell. She still didn't run away or bash my head in. I couldn't pick myself up away from the wall. "Water," I said. "Hot water, please." Her footsteps receded and then returned. She poked some kind of tube inside of my mouth, and a slow, warm trickle began to run over my teeth. My tongue tingled, followed by my throat and my chest. The hot water seeped its way down my ribs and chest, finally draining to my legs and feet. When at last my throat gurgled fluidly, my knees unlocked and I slid down the wall into a pile on the floor. She patted me on top of my knotted yarn hat. I gazed up at her. There were 4 empty thermoses, 3 large pots, and 2 plastic bowls around her crouched form. There were extra blankets wrapped around my shoulders. "I'm sorry if the bell that I put on your door scared you," she said. I squinted. "Who are you?" "I'm Swan." I scowled from under my hat. "Aren't you scared of me? Don't you want to kill me?" "Nope." She shook her head of heavy curls, all red and glowing. "You saved me. I'm sorry I followed you from the alleyway. I didn't have any other place to go. I have a room over there now. Everybody else stays clear of this floor." She took a deep breath and continued. "I tried to check in on you and your arm. It looked pretty bad, but your door was all blocked and I could hear something shuffling around in there for a few days." "How long was I in there?" 14 days. 14 days. I had slept for 14 days. I left Juliet with 1 bowl of water for 14 days. That's an eternity for a cold zombie in an early spring with a late storm, especially where there is a late freeze. I wondered how many days she had been frozen solid. Poor thing. I struggled to my feet, using my head against the wall. I scraped a bit of my forehead off on the rough surface. I could see the black smudge of skin on the already dirty wallpaper. The floral pattern looked even more grotesque. Swan gasped, "Are you okay?" She clasped her fingers over her mouth. "I'm a zombie. I'm fine." I tried to slam my door with me inside of the apartment, but one of my 3 blankets jammed in the door. I grumbled, rolled my warming eyes. Swan stood still behind me. "Do you want me to slam that for you?" she asked. "No." "Do you know how to sew?" But Swan scampered upstairs to borrow some thread from an old woman who was huddled 4 flights up. I closed the door to my apartment and sat in the hallway. I didn't want Juliet catching more of a draft, or to have Swan seeing her. When she returned, I dropped the blankets down around my waist and let her sew the sleeves back onto my shirts, and then my jacket. I also let her point a propane fan at my heat, and I let my pants legs catch on fire a few times before I stamped them out and then moved closer again. When the propane ran out and she was finished mending, I wrapped the blankets back around my arms. "Who were those men going to sell you to?" I asked, remembering how we had met. "Bait buyers, brothel, a husband, whatever." She looked grimly at the floor and then up at me. "Some men are taking as many wives as they can," she rambled. "To have as bait in the markets, or to give them babies. I mean, everybody goes all stumbly eventually, right? Might as well pop out as many kids as you can before you turn, I guess. They figure," she said. "The youngest and the least favorite wives have to go to the markets unarmed to get food and supplies until they pop out some babies. You saved me." "I think we're even," I said, patting my sleeve before successfully opening and successfully slamming my door behind me. I covered Juliet with one of my blankets. I didn't unlock my front door again until after dark. When I reopened it, Swan was sitting there, a pathetic leggy pretzel holding a candle. She lit it and looked up at me. I imagined how I glowed in that light. She didn't run or grimace. "What's your name?" Swan asked, getting to her feet. "Ophelia," I said, stomping past her on my way down the stairs. She made to follow me. "No," I said. She took 2 stairs behind me. I stopped. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked. "Coming with you?" "Do you have a weapon?" I asked. No. She stood up straighter and pushed her shoulders further back and took another step down the stairs after me. I ground my teeth so hard that they wobbled in my gums. Do you have any idea where I'm going? I asked her. No. Have you ever stolen a single thing in your life? I asked. No, but like you said, I don't have any other... You better stay close then. I continued down the stairs and out into the night. She followed me into the horrendous wind, her orange ribbons of hair bobbing out from underneath her hat, her slight frame whipping in the gusts. There was frost on all of the windows and railings. In my absence, the world had gone from humans wearing t-shirts to flatteningly cold with icicles pointed at us from the gutters. Climate change was real. Swan stood on her tiptoes. She looked up with wonder and caught a snowflake on her tongue. She danced. She spun in circles with her arm outstretched, following me. I love an April snow, she sang softly. I'm looking for propane, I told her. There's a store that sells it down over this way, I think, she said. And she pointed a flushed peach finger around the corner to the west. We're not buying it. Unless you have some cash you've been hiding. Oh, no. She trudged more slowly behind me. I paced down our street, hunching my back against the chill. I'd steal more down or fleece if I could find it. For me, for Juliet. For Swan. The dumpsters on our street were full of rubbish, things that couldn't be burned, that nobody else wanted, that were left in the pockets of headless torsos, empty propane tanks, broken plastic pieces, dead batteries, bloody clothes. I climbed up and into each one, avoiding the bloated and decapitated torsos. Only one of the propane tanks that I picked up and shook had anything left in it, and it wasn't much. But it was something, so I gave it to Swan to carry. She tucked the cold metal under her arm. I pocketed an almost empty lighter and found a wool sock with a huge hole in it. It fit my wrist as an arm warmer. I offered to pierce Swan's ear with an earring that we found, loose, with no scabs. But she declined, so we walked a few blocks in silence until we reached some wealthier buildings. We could tell that they had some money because there were rickety gates instead of broken furniture for front doors. The first fire escape that I climbed up was no good. The apartment contained dogs. Dogs could smell me a mile away, and I them. They barked loudly, ruining the whole side of the complex. I jumped down to the asphalt and led Swan around to the other side of the building. I demonstrated again how to turn a trash can upside down and stand on top of it to jump up to the fire escape. The first floor was vacant, and the second floor windows were blocked by cases of drawers. But the third floor was dimly lit by the screen of one of those little machines with dozens of buttons that needs electricity. I wouldn't mind robbing these folks. They could just buy more stuff. I looked down at Swan standing in the alleyway below. She seemed all right. Nothing was stumbling towards her. All the zombies were me, but were probably frozen again in the storm. Even Juliet. Poor Juliet. I was not taking care of her. I punched in the glass pane standing between me and the protected air of the apartment, waited, and watched. A woman sprang to the edge of her bedroom, braced herself in the doorway, nightgown swirling around her ankles. A puppy and a small boy peered around her legs. I moaned as loudly as I could. A gurgle in my throat followed it. I felt Swan jump even from below in the alleyway. The woman pushed her little ones back into the bedroom and latched the door. The sound of furniture being dragged across the floor covered my footsteps as I entered her apartment. There was a large chair blocking the inside of the front door, telling me that nobody else was expected home that night. I let another moan resound from my jaws, stepping into the kitchen. The lady pushed more furniture against the bedroom door to keep me out. I smiled. I ransacked the apartment for heating supplies and food that Swan might like. Because she was human, she still needed to eat. I lifted a whole jar of peanut butter in 2 full propane canisters. Under my arm, I tucked a rippled red aluminum can of coffee that I found in the freezer. Probably wasn't high quality, but certainly the quantity would make up for it. Hardly any of it was gone. I opened the plastic lid, inhaled deeply, stuck my finger into the grounds, and licked them off, bitter and divine. A bit of black iron caught my eye. The fireplace tools swung gently in their stand, their wrought curly handles begging to be gripped. I turned one over in my hand. It was hefty and longer than the unwieldy rolling pin that Swan had swung in the alleyway. She was going to need a better weapon, and this family had plenty to spare. I set all of the loot out on the metal fire escape. I made sure to let each item make light clanging noises, the sound of a zombie clambering out of a house to chase after something else. I took the earring out of my pocket and dropped it on top of the device that blinked at me. I couldn't very well walk into a pawn shop and sell it. Swan didn't want it. Might as well leave them a little extra gift for the items that I was taking. I stood on the fire escape and moaned loudly as I jumped down with the goods in my hands. The sound of a zombie falling out of a window to chase something below. They wouldn't risk coming out and realize they had been robbed for at least an hour. Swan helped me up to my feet. I shook her off and handed her the wrought iron fire poker. She swung it ineffectually a few times, her arm a wet noodle. No, like this. I showed her how to stand with it held up above her right ear and how to swing it down to her left hip. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And she was going to need a lock for her door in our building. She confessed that she had just been leaving it open. While she twirled in unsteady circles, her new poker outstretched in her flailing little arms, I kicked my foot into the solid front door of a renter's building with no human security guard. I kicked it until it gave way and swung inwards. A startled boy wearing glasses jumped and fell backwards into the hallway's scuffed tile floor. He scrambled to his feet, flung the contents of his pockets at me, and fled up the stairs as fast as his legs would carry him. I gave the tarnished coins to Swan and pried the door from its hinges, complete with the 3 combination deadbolts. I replaced her gaping apartment door with a sturdy stolen door. I tightened the fasteners until the door swung freely and held my ear against the locks while I turned the knobs and listened to the clicks. Having memorized the combinations, I locked us inside of her apartment with a satisfying trio of snaps and pops. Her rooms were the mirror image of mine, everything just a little bit backwards. All right. I poised my fist over the backward wooden molding. This will be our security knock. When you use it, I will know that it is you. Knock, thud, 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 knock. Oh, like this? She tried it. Thud, knock, 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 thud. No, like this, I demonstrated again. Knock, thud, 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 knock. Okay. I just found a typo. Okay, I got it, she said, and rapped her fist against the plaster wall. Knock, thud, 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 thud. No, like this, I gritted my teeth. Oh, like this? She tap-danced across the wooden floor. Tap, 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 shuffle, shuffle, stomp, stomp, tap, tap, tap. She fell down giggling next to her burner. I handed her a full canister of propane. No, this is serious. It's so that you'll know I'm not a zombie when I knock. You are a zombie, she tittered as she struck a match against the fly of her pants and set the gas under the burner aflame. When I gave her the peanut butter, she leapt up and down on her toes before settling onto the floor to rip the foil seal from the lid. She stuck a filthy finger into the rich cream and spread it across her tongue. She dragged the extra smears off her finger between her teeth and smacked her lips happily. Her scarlet hair puffed out around her face, but not even her big sweater and wool blankets could make the rest of her look bulky. Do you get cold? I asked. She shook her head and pointed to a pan full of ashes next to her burner. There was lots of stuff in here to burn. She walked over to a shelf. She pulled off a stack of books. I knew that they weren't important maps, but when she held the corner of one to the propane flame, I grabbed her wrist roughly. She jumped. Don't burn those, I said, taking the cloth volume from her grasp and staring at my cold, dead fingers wrapped around her peachy, thin skin. A dried black fleck of my blood, from where I had broken the glass window, fell onto her arm. Ah, get it off of you! I huffed and puffed and blew the infected speck off of her bare, flimsy skin, spattering her with spittle that I thrashed to wipe off of her with my sleeve. I leapt away from her warm, skinny body, waiting to see if I had ruined her life with my blood and my drool. I jumped all the way to the bookshelf, wrapping my arms around the book I had taken from her. She rubbed her wrist where I had grabbed it and frowned, but she just went back to working the peanut butter around her teeth. Oh, geez. You need to relax. I'm not that fragile, she grumbled. I'm fine. And I don't know about you, but I can't even read those books. They're more useful for fuel than anything else. I set the gingham-bound volume that I had rescued back on the overflowing bookshelf. A large, deep brown spine caught my eye. I stroked it. It was massive and covered in taut leather. I pulled it off the plank and into my arms. I opened it. There weren't very many pictures, just a few line drawings of birds and roses and swords. I ran my fingers across the squiggles that I couldn't read. I liked it. I don't know, I said. I think books are kind of nice. I guess I wish I could read signs, she agreed and looked down at the peanut butter jar. Sk. Ooh. Scoopy peanut butter. I can read a little. Can I take this with me? I asked of the huge brown tome. Sure. She curled into her sloppy nest blanket in the middle of the floor. Don't burn the rest, I instructed. Will I see you tomorrow? She flopped her head under her rag pillow. Sure you will. Good morning. Sleep well. I closed her door behind me. Good morning, she sighed, rustling deeply into her rattling quilts. Sweet dreams, Ophelia. And there we have it. There we have Swan. Swan, a warm, fragile human. Starting to have some humans back in our stories. What do you think of that? I think it's great. Well, fantastic. We'll pick up more soon.